Good morning. I'm Cynthia Cook, the Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm very pleased this morning to be able to introduce Lieutenant General Michael Guetlein, who is the Director of the Space Systems Center, which is the United States Space Force's acquisition arm. General Guetlein is responsible for approximately 10,000 employees nationwide and an annual budget of $11 billion. He's responsible for managing the research, design, development, acquisition, launch, and sustainment of satellites and their associated command and control systems. His extensive portfolio includes military satellite communication, missile warning, navigation and timing, space-based weather, space launch and test ranges, space superiority, responsive space, and other emerging evolutionary space programs. So quite an extensive and complicated portfolio. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, CSIS and Cynthia, for welcoming us here today.
We're really excited about this conversation and want to know if you would like to start with any kind of remarks before I start peppering you with questions.
No, I think these dialogues are extremely important.
Okay.
There's been a tremendous amount of change in both the space environment as well as in an acquisition environment over the past year-ish. Dialogues like this help us get the word out about the things that are changing, all the great and wonderful activities that we got going on, how we are getting after the threat, and how we are embracing commercial and industry as well as our allied partners in the protect and defend mission area of space.
Okay, well, why don't we start with the first question, which is the Space Systems Center was set up just under 1 year ago. How has it evolved from its predecessor, the Space and Missile Systems Center? Where do you see the command going in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years? And what are your priorities and your main agenda in shaping the future of Space Systems Command?
So you probably have to repeat those again. But let me get the.
It's quite a long list.
Let me do the first one. Space Systems Command. Why did we stand up Space Systems Command? We stood up Space Systems Command because we needed to make a pivot. We needed to make a pivot in the way we acquire our systems. We needed to make a pivot in the way we are going to guarantee our space capabilities to our nation during times of crisis or conflict, and start building resiliency into our capabilities. We needed to make a pivot to start getting after unity of effort across the entire federal government, the way we acquire our systems, as well as industry, academia, and our other government partners and allies. The last thing that we needed to do to make a pivot within Space Systems Command is actually get after a system-to-systems integration. We had spent an enormous amount of time building very exquisite space capabilities, the best in the world, best on the planet, in areas like Satcom, missile warning, GPS, weather, and these were all world-class systems, but they were all built amongst specific mission areas. Coming in with Space Systems Command, it was clear that to get after the emerging threat, we're going to have to go at it in a very integrated manner. So part of standing up Space Systems Command was actually establishing the Space Systems Integration Office, SSIO, under Dr. Claire Leon. Dr. Leon had brought to the table an enormous amount of industry experience as well as government experience and system engineering experience. So she's perfectly suited to get after the systems integration. So as we stood up Space Systems Command, we actually now reached across all of DoD and IC to start trying to build those partnerships to get that unity of effort and then to build that integration up front. When we stood up Space Systems Command, we actually spent a lot of time trying to understand what the best of breed was between how the Rapid Capabilities Offices did business, how the National Reconnaissance Office did business, how Missile Defense Agency did business, and then tried to take the best that we'd already put in place with the Space and Missile Systems Center and then get the best of breed across the organization. So what you see amongst Space Systems Command today is a very flat organization that kind of mimics the way the NRO did their tower structure. We've gone to 4 program executive officers that are empowered. They work directly for the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration, the Secretary Calvelli. Those 5 PEOs are fully empowered for the life cycle of their program. So we got that kind of tower approach that you saw at the NRO. With Space Systems Integration Office under Dr. Leon, we were able to get after the exquisite system engineering capabilities that you saw at the Missile Defense Agency. And then by embracing the middle tier acquisition, the adaptive acquisition framework that had come from Secretary Lord, the PEOs are able to engage in that rapid capabilities type approach to acquisitions as well. So what we actually put in place was this very flat organization structure that is very agile. So you asked me, there's two other questions. One of them was about where are we going in the future? Where do I see in the next 5 to 10 years? With the increasing threat, is become very apparent to us that no organization, no agency, and no allied partner is going to be able to go alone. We're going to have to start really embracing our partnerships. So you're going to start seeing hybrid architectures. And by hybrid, what do I mean by that? That means a mixture of government-owned, government-operated, combined with commercial-owned, commercial-operated, combined with allied systems that are networked and integrated across. So that is going to require a different type of skill set than what we have traditionally brought to the table in acquisitions. I'm going to need an acquisition workforce that really understands system engineering. I'm going to need an acquisition workforce that understands foreign military sales and how to do international affairs. I'm going to need a workforce that understands how to do commercial services. Those are three skill sets that we traditionally didn't have a lot of in space acquisitions that we're now trying to build out going forward. And then there was a third element, and I've kind of lost track of it.
Priorities for the future.
Priorities for the future. Priorities is going to be maintaining that unity of effort across all of our government partners, which we've got an enormous amount going on today, and I'll kind of get to that a little bit later in the discussion. Embracing our allies. Traditionally, space had been a no foreign type environment for the U.S., highly classified. We're trying to break down those stovepipes, trying to embrace our allied partners, share data, not have to recreate capabilities if one partner has it over the other. We're trying to significantly embrace our commercial partners and our academic partners to bring the whole of the U.S. and the whole of our allied partners to the table when we're trying to solve problems to get after the threat.
Those are really important aspects of a vision. Can we drill down a little bit and talk more about how you're planning to get there? Getting a well-trained acquisition workforce is an endemic challenge across the Department of Defense. Not because people aren't good, but because they have other opportunities. They may go to industry, they may retire. So how do you propose to recruit, train, and maintain the expert workforce that you'd like to have at SSE?
That is a great question, and at the heart of a lot of our focus. We are seeing an explosion in interest in space like we have not seen since the push to the moon. That interest in space is sparked a new generation that is focused on learning about space. They're going to the school and learning astrophysics and astroengineering, a lot of the sciences. So we're seeing at a younger age an enormous amount of interest, and we're trying to continue to mentor that interest. So we spend a lot of time in the grade schools and elementaries and high schools trying to mentor the students. But also we're spending a lot of time trying to build university partnership programs on two avenues there. One is we need the universities to help us solve our problems. They have the deep technical knowledge that we need for space to help bring to the table to solve these technical problems. But then also their students that are coming through, we're actually trying to bring them in as interns and start growing them from day one. And then when they graduate, have a pathway that we can immediately bring them into the workforce. That kind of gets us after the core foundational. But with the stand-up of Space Systems Command, we are no longer Los Angeles focused. We are now across 16 sites, 16 locations globally, to include the Cape and Vandenberg. That allows us access to a lot more talent than we traditionally had in the Air Force Space Acquisition Program. So now as U.S. Space, or U.S. Space Force acquisitions, we are able to reach across a broader depth. So by leveraging those geographical locations, leveraging the university partner positions, but then also leveraging commercial to bring them in to help try to help us solve the problems. And we'll talk a little bit more later about how we are embracing commercial. But there's an enormous amount of wealth of innovation, wealth of knowledge, that they can bring to the table to help us get after our problems.
Okay, that's a hard challenge, and I'm glad to hear all of your efforts in that area. My next question is for all the acquisition nerds in the audience. I count myself as number one here. Are there any acquisition process changes that you'd like the space community, including commercial industry, to know about?
There are some significant process changes. So I would say the Department of the Air Force has spent many years listening to the woes of acquisition and trying to determine how best to get after acquisition. In the early 2000s, we had numerous programs that were over cost, over schedule. And we've been trying to step back and look at, how did we get there? What were the challenges that drove those program issues, and how do we get after that? So within the Department of the Air Force, with the help of the Hill, we immediately stood up the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition Integration. Secretary Calvelli, he came on a little less than 2 weeks ago. He's already been out to Los Angeles doing deep dives on the programs. So it's really wonderful to see him here. But now you have an assistant secretary focused purely on space acquisition. The four PEOs report directly to Secretary Calvelli. That enables us to go a lot faster in space through the decision cycles that we traditionally had to kind of slog our way through within the Pentagon and within the department. So we're getting a little bit faster there. With the help of Congress, we stood up the Space Acquisition Council. The Space Acquisition Council is chaired by Secretary Calvelli, but it has advisors from the Director of the Missile Defense Agency, has advisors from the Director of the National Reconnaissance Office, OSD Policy, OSD R&E, OSD A&T, just to name a few, as well as the warfighters, sit on the Space Acquisition Council at a senior secretary 4-star level, driving unity of effort in their decisions to make sure that we as a department speak with one voice when we make an acquisition decision. And we're seeing that kind of in the missile warning, missile defense, missile track realm play out. So you got the Assistant Secretary, you got the Space Acquisition Council. Then we stood up this entity called the Program Integration Council, which was built to achieve something that we've never done in my 30 years of career, is to get all of the acquisition organizations deconflicted and speaking with one voice. So in the Program Integration Council sits the Space Systems Command Commander, the Director of the Missile Defense Agency, the Director of the Space Development Agency, the Director of Space RCO, the Director of RCO, and the Deputy Director of the National Reconnaissance Office. So you have all 6 arms of acquisition sitting in there. But we also brought in Andrew Cox from the Space Warfare Analysis Center to give that AOA kind of flavor to the Program Integration Council. We brought in the warfighter, so SPOC Commander, General Whiting sits on it, as well as the U.S. Space Command Vice Commander, General Shaw sits on it. But then we brought in commercial services, international affairs, warfighter integration, and the labs into that conversation. So we truly are, from an acquisition processes perspective, trying to drive unity of effort. I don't think industry's ever seen us do that and speak with one voice, especially because of the classified nature of our programs. We often operated in our own stovepipes, our own vacuums, without understanding what the other organizations were doing. Now everybody that's on the PIC is cross-cleared. So we are having open and transparent conversations just about everything that we're doing in space.
Do you see that leading to greater integration among space programs themselves?
Absolutely, absolutely. So just to kind of give you first ever, when we submitted our POM inputs for FY24, we actually submitted deconflicted POMs between all those organizations I just talked about. And we had open, transparent dialogue amongst all those organizations about our program POM inputs. So the budget that went in was already deconflicted so that when it comes to the Pentagon or goes to the Hill, they understand we've already talked, and we've made sure that we've integrated capabilities back and forth.
And they can see how the parts fit together.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So let's take the next question, moving from within SSC to the broader community. How does the Space Systems Command work with the space-related components of all the military services, like the Department of the Navy and Army, and even the broader Air Force, to determine warfighter needs and set requirements?
So under the requirements umbrella, we are still under the JROC process, the Joint Requirements Oversight Committee. So the Joint Staff still sets the requirements. They still validate them. The one thing that has changed is CSRO, Lieutenant General LaCory, working for General Raymond, actually validates all space requirements now. Okay. So that's one element that has changed. When General LaCory gets done validating the requirements, then he hands them to the acquisition organizations, being the Program Integration Council members, that then figure out how best to deliver those requirements to get after the warfighter's needs. One thing that we changed, or we're in the process of changing within the Space Force, is that we are going to add space components to each of the combatant commands. But within the acquisition community, I stood up the Warfighter Integration Office in January that reports to an 06. And we are going to put an acquisition expert in each one of the combatant commands, starting with INDOPACOM, then US Space, and then SPOC. Excuse me. And the next summer, we'll move on to AFRICOM and CENTCOM and EUCOM. Those experts are going to be the conduit from the combatant commander to speak their voice of what they need into the acquisition system, but also be feeding the capabilities that we're building in the acquisition system back into the combatant commands so that they can play them in war games and exercises. Then we can feed those lessons back into the acquisition program to make sure that we're delivering is actually going to be relevant to what the fight is and what the combatant command's requirements are, and it's going to be time relevant as well.
So you really thought through the organization and the connections with the other outside organizations that will play a role in what you're doing.
Yes, ma'am.
So, can you talk about the Space Warfighting Analysis Center a little bit more? How do you think through new program concepts from the twinkle in the eye phase through the execution phase?
So the Space Warfare Analysis Center is basically our analysis agency for space. It's led by Dr. Andrew Cox, and they are doing some pretty amazing work. The analysis that they do is physics-based, machine-based, so that we are actually flying our concepts, our future concepts, against a threat-realistic environment, so we can understand how they operate, how they can support, protect, and defend, et cetera. And then we can run numerous Monte Carlo analysis to optimize those force designs that are coming out. So the way we have kind of set it up is Andrew Cox has got some pretty high-powered analysts with some pretty high-powered tools that are doing the analysis, but we are supporting Andrew Cox in that analysis with the Program Integration Council. The reason that is important is if you look at the way we used to do it, we would do an analysis of alternatives that would take us a couple of years. We would kick out that analysis of alternatives to the requirements community. They would try to translate that into a set of requirements that the acquisition groups could go off and execute. The acquisition agencies would get those requirements and they do a cost estimate, find out that the technology is not mature, find out that it's going to take 10 to 15 years to build this capability, and then we would hand back a bill, multi-billions for capability. And then the process would start over because of sticker shock. With the Space Warfare Analysis Center doing force design and with the Program Integration Council members supporting Andrew Cox, not only is he doing a physics-based model, but it's now informed by the cost community, it's informed by the acquirers and the labs to make sure the technology is mature and it's something I can build. It's informed by the warfighter to make sure it's going to be time relevant, a capability that they need, and that it's going to actually meet their requirements. It's informed by what the allies can do. It's informed by what is the state of the art of commercial, and commercial has an engagement back in. And it's informed by all of the PEOs that sit in there to give their input from an acquisition perspective. So when we get that force design, we no longer have that sticker shock. We no longer have an architecture I can't execute. We actually have a set of what we need to go do that is actually executable. So they're paying a lot of dividends in SWAC.
So you've just sort of covered the history of space acquisition for the last 35 years.
Yes, ma'am.
And really put your finger on some of the opportunities for improvement in the space acquisition community. And let me just pick up on one thing you mentioned at the end of that discussion of how you're redoing the acquisition, and that is the connections with industry. So in the past, requirements have sometimes been set with no attention to the latest developments in what industry can offer. Arguably, a lot of innovation in space technology now is coming straight from the commercial sector. It's not driven by the government. And this, I would not have predicted it 20 years ago. So could you talk about how the Space Systems Center is working to stay in touch with everything industry is doing and incorporating it into force design and into acquisition programs?
So staying in touch with everything is a challenge. We are seeing more innovation coming out of industry than we have seen since, like I said, to the push to the moon. An enormous amount, and to the point today where the innovation is actually outpacing the demand signal from the government,
Yes.
which traditionally hasn't happened. So the challenge is, how do I embrace that innovation, and how do I capitalize on that innovation from a government perspective? We're doing that in many different lanes. We just started talking about the Space Warfare Analysis Center. Andrew Cox hosts industry days throughout his force design to allow industry to give their input along the way to say, have you thought about this? This is the state of technology, et cetera. Not only that, but he took all those models and capabilities that they developed in Space Warfare Analysis Center and made them available to industry. So industry can now play their innovation against what we believe is a threat realistic physics-based environment to understand how it's going to play within our set of requirements. So we're trying to embrace them from that direction. From a Space Systems Command perspective, we stood up the Commercial Services Office. The Commercial Services Office, their whole job, they report directly to me, but their whole job is to embrace as much of the commercial industry as we can. So when we stood up Space Systems Command, we did it with a mantra of, we're going to exploit what we have first, buy what we can, and build only what we must type model. So under that buy what I can model, the Commercial Services Office has the responsibility of trying to look across all of industry to understand what's in the realm of the possible. Can I adapt a piece of technology that was built for something else to solve one of my problems over here? Are they already building it for somebody else? How can I do that? And then the last thing that we did to take advantage of commercial industry, industry's innovation, is stood up what we called the SSC front door, the Space Systems Command front door. There was an enormous amount of energy over the last couple of years put into engaging industry in multiple different buckets, to the point where we had created so many opportunities and had put so many different acronyms and office names and et cetera out there that we completely confused industry. They had no idea how to come do business with the government. So we stood up the SSC front door. We added what we call Sherpas to that. So they will be the ones that will help shepherd some of the startups and the small businesses through how to do business with the government. They will be the ones that kind of show the pathway to a customer. We are working on everything from venture capitalism to space prime to Hackasat to SpaceWorks, all of those different opportunities to embrace innovation in industry are now under the umbrella of the front door to try to simplify that interface to industry. The last thing we're doing is monthly industry engagements.
Okay.
For example, we had one in the fall that was space-to-space communications, where we had all of the DoD as well as NASA was there, DARPA was there, the IC was there, to communicate to industry. This is what we as a government are headed in space-to-space comms, whether that be RF or optical or what have you, across all orbital regimes. Tomorrow, we're holding a tactical ISR industry day, but it's going to be a reverse industry day, where we'll have the PEOs and the PMs in a room, and industry now can come tell us what they can provide in the realm of tactical ISR. So that allows us to learn more about what's out there that we may not be seeing. Next month, we will do one on cislunar space domain awareness. The month after that, we're going to do one on commercial analysis tools that are available, and it just keeps on going every month after that.
So there's a lot of engagement between the space acquisition community and industry. How do you get what the capabilities that commercial industry can offer to the warfighter, to your notional Captain Snuffy space operator? How do you make sure that the requirement setters understand where industry is going, so that when they write the requirements, these accurately represent what industry can do?
So it's happening on multiple fronts. General Dickinson was in the press yesterday talking about his commercial cell that he has stood up within U.S. space to take advantage of commercial services. So he is looking at across all his problems of, hey, where can I tap into commercial today to get after my pain points? On the other side of the coin, That commercial services office sits in on the force designs from SWAC. That commercial services office sits in on the writing of the requirements with the requirements community. And then they sit in on the Program Integration Council, where we make recommendations to the acquisition authorities on how best to get after capabilities, which includes commercial. We also, within the 22 NDAA now, Secretary Calvelli has to certify, as we're going off to build new capabilities, that there's not a commercial alternative out there. So that requires us to do even more analysis along the way to understand it. So I think there's an enormous amount of effort out there to try to ferret out what can commercial build or bring to the table. The last thing that we're trying to do, which is kind of the holy grail of this whole thing, is then how do I build the business model to allow commercial to easily engage? Right now we're working with OSD and SAF-FM on what does that business model look like? Can I build a working capital fund? Is it a cost reimbursement fund? What have you? But that working model, that business model, if you will be the model that we do that easy transaction back and forth without having to go through a long contracts process, source selections, all that kind of stuff. How do you streamline that? And then within the POM process, we're trying to make sure that we've built in the funding mechanisms to embrace commercial as well.
Talk to me about any success stories you've had with getting reluctant offerers to actually be willing to do business with the government. You know, it really is two sides of the house. The government can do, the Space Force can do what it can do to try to make it a great environment for commercial companies to come and sell to you. Do you have have you ever reached out to companies that just said, no thank you, no matter what you do, I'm not interested? How do you break through that? Because that's where there's some innovation.
Part of it's going to start with the Sherpas. And the Sherpas are backed up with our contracting community to kind of teach industry how to do business with the government. A lot of smaller businesses either can't or don't want to do business with the government because of the amount of overhead I bring to the table, or overhead requirements that I bring to the table. And they just can't operate in that environment. So that's where you start to explore creative contracting mechanisms like for fixed price contracts that gets rid of some of that bureaucracy and says, hey, I'm just going to buy the product from you if we can build this mentoring relationship. If that avenue doesn't work, we're also working with the venture capitalists to say, hey, here's a piece of technology in small business today that you could probably invest in that small business and get a 20-fold return in the future because we see a pathway of how this could be used in the future in space. So there's many different areas that we're trying to engage industry to bring them to the table. I would say the other area that is gaining a lot of momentum is the Space Development Agency under Derek Tournier. Derek is engaging industry across the board in very efficient manners to try to bring their capability immediately to the table to rapidly deliver his Tranche 0 and Tranche 1 networks.
Okay, good. Following up and taking it in a slightly different direction, a lot of space capabilities can come either from government developed, owned, and operated systems, or they could come as a commercial service. How do you make trades between owning the capability and buying it as a service?
It's not super complicated, but it does require a little bit of calculus. We got to really understand how that capability is going to be used in the future in that time of crisis or time of conflict. And how do I depend on that capability in the future? If I cannot guarantee that it will be there when I need it, then I probably need to own it more than lease it. If industry can guarantee that that capability will be there in time of crisis or conflict, then I can probably buy those services. And I would rather buy those services than have to go build something myself and depend on it. Commercial also, in a time of crisis or conflict, gives us proliferation and gives us redundancy across our networks, which actually buys us a lot of resiliency. So we're also bringing that into the equation from a service perspective or whether a government-owned, contractor-operated, what have you, type model. So it is a spectrum that we go through of decisions that we go through trying to understand. But at the end of the day, it really is how we're going to use it in a time of crisis or conflict.
Okay, that makes sense. So this is question that that's coming out of our conversation. So you've had quite a remarkable career, making contributions to the United States for the last 30 years, as you said. When you look back at that, what lessons do you take from any particular incidents or experiences that you had that are really shaping your leadership of the Space Systems Center? What do you draw on when as a leader now?
I think that if you go back to the beginning of the space race, back to the 50s, the 60s, to General Schriever and some of his predecessors, because the criticality of the space and the classified nature of space, we took very little risk along the way. And because space costs so much, we took even less risk. As our appetite for risk kept going down, we kept pulling the authorities and responsibilities and accountability up higher and higher and higher, to where we were not empowering our junior workforce. In many cases, we were not empowering our program managers. And in many cases, we had to go to the most senior levels within the Pentagon to get approval. What that had the effect of doing is, first of all, it demoralized the workforce because we are spending an enormous amount of money in national treasure training them and getting them prepared and then not giving them the tools to get their job done. But it also really slowed down the decision-making process and even added even more cost to our systems. So throughout my career, I was continuously thinking if we could just push the authorities down, if we could just take more risk, we could probably move a little bit faster, move a little bit cheaper, and deliver more capability to the nation. So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking as a senior leader. The 5 PEOs that we've stood up within Space Systems Command, like I said, they report to Secretary Capabilities. They do not report to me. They are fully empowered to do what they got to do with their workforce. They don't have to say, "Mother, may I," to myself at all. We have pushed as much authority down to the lowest levels of the material leaders, which are our lieutenant colonel level, as we possibly can. I'm trying to delegate down orders authority so that they have control of their workforce and keep pushing that down. As I lead up and have the conversations with Secretary Kelly, with Secretary Kendall, with Secretary LaPlante, et cetera, my advocacy is always don't pull the authorities up, push the authorities down. But at the same time, then we have to deliver. So then I have to spend a lot of time making sure that our workforce is enabled, that I give them the tools to be successful.
So smart delegation to the right level. That's a good a lesson, and actually it's something I've seen having done research on the space community for 20 years. There has been a transformation. Talk about taking risks in programs. You were describing the old sort of large, exquisite programs where risk was attempted to be designed out as much as possible. And now we're seeing, a middle tier of acquisition being used. The space has its own rapid capability office. So talk about how you're accepting smart risk in space programs.
Yes, ma'am. So if we go back to where I talked about where space was in the early 2000s, the cost of launch could easily exceed $400 million per launch. A satellite capability like missile warning was a no-fail mission.
Yes.
We had to have the eyes in the sky to understand what the Russians were up to from a nuclear posture and to make sure we weren't surprised over the poles. So we really couldn't take a lot of risk going along the way. What that effect had, though, was we kept aggregating more and more capabilities onto a single satellite because I wanted to maximize what the bang I got for the buck from the launch vehicle, but also to make sure that we had that unblinking eye in the sky. Well, that resulted in a satellite that in some cases cost in excess of $2 billion for one satellite that was built for a benign environment that was uncontested. That's an enormous amount of national treasure sitting in one basket that was really driven by technology at the time. Well, technology's exploded. Thanks to companies like SpaceX, ULA, Blue Origin, they have pushed the cost of launch down in the sub $100 million per launch. The satellite manufacturers have pushed the level of technology that I can put on a small satellite significantly high. So I no longer have to aggregate all those exquisite capabilities onto one satellite. I can now disaggregate across the constellation. Well, that allows me to take more risk because now in a disaggregated constellation, I can stomach 1 or 2 failures and still have a robust constellation through proliferation, redundancy, et cetera, to get at the capability. So that's one area that we're trying to take risk. When you bring that into the acquisition side, where you're enabled from that perspective with the middle tier acquisition authorities, is because the risk is not so high on that one vehicle failing, I can now spread that acquisition out through cost and schedule and actually move a lot faster and actually put 70% level capabilities on multiple platforms that aggregate up rather than having to have 100% of my capabilities on one platform. So there's numerous areas there where we've been allowed to take risk along the way.
So the connection between the decrease in the cost of launch plus the possibility of disaggregated capabilities has been a real game changer.
And the rapid increase in technology.
Okay, good. Okay, that tracks with what many of us have seen, and I think it is an outstanding opportunity for SSC to acquire capabilities that make a difference. I do have one question that is a very specific question, so I will read that out to make sure I get it right. What was behind the decision to restart production of MUOS narrowband satellites in the FY23 budget request rather than transition narrowband Satcom to a commercial capability such as Iridium or Starlink?
That was a requirements decision that I was not a part of.
Okay.
But I will tell you, as we have done a lot of our analysis across the protect and defend mission area in time of crisis and conflict, the one thing that is always needed is more comm. We never have enough comm to get after what we need to do. So one of the decisions they made was, like you said, to extend it, is because we needed more comm to support the fight. And I suspect you'll see more of that going forward. I will also tell you, though, that the Commercial Services Office has a commercial Satcom office underneath it that works for me, that sits up, they sit up near DISA, but they work for the United States Space Force. They are doing an enormous amount of business with commercial on the order of about $2+ billion over just the next 2 years alone in commercial Satcom. I think you'll continue to see that increase going forward, as well as our Satcom opportunities with our allied partners like Luxembourg and Norway.
Well, I could talk the details of acquisition process for the rest of our time, but perhaps others in the audience might like me to move on to some different topics.
Okay.
So I will leave acquisition and move to something you just mentioned, which is alliances. So given NATO's recent focus on space as a warfighting domain, has this changed the way the U.S. military is working with NATO allies when it comes to space acquisition? Talk about how you coordinate with our allies around the world.
Absolutely. It has changed quite dramatically just within the last 2 years across the entire international landscape. What has become clear to us is that the adversary has proven not only the capability to deny our use of space, but has proven the intent in many different instances. That has brought the allies closer together. We all understand that we're going to have to collaborate and graduate to get after the protect and defend mission and to guarantee our space capabilities are available to our individual nations. So that's brought a lot more international dialogue to the table. From a Space Systems Command, how we're supporting that dialogue is we stood up the International Affairs Office under Ms. Deanna Riles. Ms. Riles has really reached out and engaged across the entire spectrum, not just NATO, but all of our other allies as well, in trying to build partnerships in sharing data, partnerships in building programs, partnerships in transitioning technology, et cetera. NATO individually has stood up significantly in space in the last couple of years. They stood up their space center, they're going to stand up Space Center of Excellence. They stood up a space command center in 2020. We have Brigadier General Jim Smith, who is a space operator. He is currently the MILDEP to NATO, trying to drive those conversations in space. We are seeing that as NATO allies try to meet that 2% of GDP that they're trying to achieve, they are starting to push more and more of that GDP towards space to get after those cooperative programs. So we're seeing a significant increase. That is also requiring us within the DoD to make some pivots in the way we have the dialogue. I talked about space was traditionally always labeled no foreign. We're trying to get that no foreign moniker out of everything that we do. We're also trying to bust down the classifications at every opportunity we can, both within the IC and within the DoD, to make sure that we can actually share that data. If you look at the way we're working around the world today, for example, I have 2 UK officers and an Australian officer that work for Space Systems Command in Los Angeles. That's never happened before. And they're asking for more. We've sent a lieutenant colonel over to Australia. So an enormous amount of dialogue that's just traditionally never happened. We are currently navigating our way through the processes of now how do I get more and more permissions to have more and more dialogue.
That speaks to enhanced cooperation on the acquisition side. Are you seeing the operators also trying to ensure coordination with partners and allies?
Absolutely. We have international officers on the floor up at Vandenberg. We have international officers at U.S. Space Command in Colorado Springs. We have a combined operations floor in Vandenberg where they are looking at across our allied partners. So we're seeing across the board an engagement with the allies.
Okay. Along with dealing with challenges of classification, which are always an issue with space, are there any other areas that you'd like to address to improve coordination and cooperation with allies? I mean, this is obviously a very rich area for the future.
It is. Where we are spending a lot of time is in the policy realm. Things like ITAR. What kind of technology can I transfer over to our allied partners? How can I get a combined space domain awareness C2 system as an example, so we all have the same battle space awareness and battle space situation analysis? A lot of those are policy-driven questions that just take time to nug your way through. We are seeing the nation engaging those conversations. But I personally would like them to see it go a little bit faster.
That makes sense. So let's move from acquisition to allies to what we're concerned about, which is the threat. What counterspace capabilities are you most concerned about in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years, I'm worried about every single one of them. I don't think there's one that's more important than the other. I will tell you the thing that keeps me up at night, though, is the demonstrated unprofessional, unsafe behavior from our adversaries. CSIS just wrote a report in April kind of talking about all the different threats. One of the things that CSIS talked about was November of last year, the Russians launched a rocket at one of their own satellites. You could say, hey, they're allowed to blow up one of their own satellites. However, it was in international space. It blew that satellite up into a couple thousand pieces. Those 1,000 pieces sent the astronauts at the space station scrambling for their escape capsules, including 2 cosmonauts. Proof positive of operating in a very unsafe and very unprofessional manner. In 2019, the Russians snuggled up to a U.S. satellite. The U.S. satellite tried to move out of the way, and the Russians continued to follow it. What made that problematic was we didn't know what the Russians' intent was. We didn't know what the Russians' capability is. Why were they getting so close to another satellite in a very unsafe manner? So what keeps me up at night is that they are willing to operate unsafe, unprofessional in the space environment and continuing to demonstrate their intent. We're seeing it across jammers. We're seeing it across robots in space. We're seeing it across direct descent, which is missiles into space. We're seeing it across the entire spectrum, and they all keep me awake at night. Okay,
well, why don't I follow up on the easier of those 2 challenges, which is the question of space debris. This is a growing challenge. As adversaries blow up satellites to make a point that they can, as satellites degrade and stop working and they're still in orbit. How are you doing anything to manage this and protect satellites?
We're doing a tremendous amount from a U.S. perspective of trying to manage the debris. We actually, on every single launch, go through an analysis of how much orbital debris are we going to generate, how much are we going to leave behind. And if it exceeds a threshold, which is a pretty tight threshold, we actually have to go through higher levels of approval. because the space environment is a sanctuary for all of us. And if we pollute that environment to where we can't operate safely, it's going to affect all of humankind. So from a U.S. Space Force perspective, we try to really limit the debris up there. We are also starting to engage conversations with industry about debris mitigation. How can we remove some of the debris? How can we reuse some of the capability that is up there? And then we are supporting the policy side of the house and have international discussions on how to limit the amount of debris internationally.
Okay. So a combination of trying to stop the growth of debris plus looking for commercial solutions to clean it up.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So now let's talk about the second and possibly more difficult of the two challenges you mentioned, which is our potential adversaries operating unsafely in space. Are there any policy solutions, international agreements, work by the UN, or any other possible solutions you can see to this, or is it just something we're going to have to live with for the near future?
I am not the policy guy, so I'm the wrong person
I'm not the policy person
to
either.
be asking those kind of questions, to be answering those kind of questions. I do see an enormous amount of energy across the board as a whole of government trying to get after this problem. Everywhere from space traffic management to debris mitigation to what are the norms in space for operational behavior. An enormous amount of dialogue that I think we absolutely got to continue to support and eventually to get to some common ground in the future.
Okay, thanks. That's a hard question for acquisition folks. But let me take it back to one that's more acquisition focused, which is you've talked about these threats. Can you draw a link between these threats and your acquisition priorities?
Absolutely. So I talked about why we stood up Space Systems Command. One of the reasons was to actually guarantee to the nation that their space capabilities will be there in a time of crisis or conflict. And the way that I do that is by building in resiliency. That could be resiliency by hardening a satellite, that could be resiliency through proliferation, be resiliency through disaggregation, et cetera. So if you were to look at our priorities going forward and we're actually investing the dollars, it goes back to that business model that I talked about up front. First, I want to exploit what I have, then buy what I can, and then build only what I must. In the exploit what I can is we have an enormous amount of space capability up there today. The best in the world. We as a nation have built the most technologically advanced space capabilities, et cetera. But like I told you up front, they weren't integrated and networked like they could be. So under the exploit what we have, we're spending a lot of time and effort in understanding how can I network, exploit, and take advantage of the capabilities I have in new and innovative ways. If you jump into the buy what I can, we're spending a lot of time talking to industry about what services can they bring to the table and talking about our allied partners about what can they bring to the table, and then integrating and networking those. So our priority as we start to put our investment priorities forward is in that second bucket. The last bucket, build only what we must. These are the capabilities that do not exist today in our allied partners nor our commercial partners, and that we need to go invest in, like missile warning, missile track, missile defense. Those are capabilities that we're going to have to go build in the future. Our priorities then are to make sure that we are building that unblinking eye for the nation in a time of crisis or conflict to make sure that that system's actually going to be there and be able to survive in a threat environment or even in a natural environment.
That makes sense. All right, well you've answered some pretty tough questions today, General. Thank you. Do you have any sort of additional thoughts that you'd like to share or a message for anybody who might be listening back at SSE?
I think, first of all, let me start with the importance of space is not just for military. The importance of space is for our way of life, our peaceful way of life. Everything that we do today depends on space, whether it be our cell phones, our transportation networks, how we do agriculture, how we distribute product to the shelves, transportation, what you name it. Even our financial markets are driven by the signal off of GPS for timing. So our way of life and the way of life for our children and our children's children will be dependent on space. So it is up to all of us to make sure that we can protect and defend it, to make sure that we can continue to enjoy that way of life. I will tell you from a national perspective, you should be very proud of your country. We have not only delivered the most capable systems within the entire world, but we have built the most capable space force built by the world's greatest Air Force. That is not lost on our allies, our adversaries. Our adversaries are paying attention, and they are taking note. So you should be extremely proud of the men and women that have spent decades delivering these capabilities, and will spend decades going forward protecting and defending them going forward. The last thing I would like to throw, just because I have the stage, is thanks to the families. We ask an enormous lot of our guardians and our airmen, whether they be in uniform or out, but there's an enormous amount of families behind them that support us, and we greatly appreciate everything that they have done and support their nation as well. But I greatly thank your time and CSIS's time today.
Thank
for
you.
allowing me to come talk.
I'm going to ask a kicker just based on what you just said, and it's an easy one, so don't worry. But you've really set the bar high for what SSC is doing. Can you give us some thoughts to the policy community, the CSISs, the other think tanks, the FFRDCs? What should we be looking at? What would you like to see that come out of the think tank community to bring this conversation forward?
You have an enormously capable workforce out there. Not only within uniform, but our civil servants, our industry partners, and our allied partners. An enormous amount of capability and talent out there. How do you continue to best leverage that talent to get after your problems? We as a society are control-based. And every time that we stumble, we add more controls to the process to the point where we over-control it. And we end up stifling that innovation that's built into that workforce that we have. If you look at our core competencies as a nation going into a crisis or conflict, what are they? First and foremost, it's our people. Beyond a shadow of doubt is our people. The second one is our industry. We have the most innovative industry out there. You give them a problem, they will find a solution.
That is true.
The last thing that makes us so successful as a society is our allied partners. We are very good at building partnerships. So as you bring to the table from a think tank perspective, how do you engage that talent and then start to reduce those control mechanisms that allow the innovation to continue to flourish?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, General Guetlein. And thank you, audience, for listening today.